How to rev a B204 with Trionic 5 past 8,000 RPM and actually have it work. Why should you listen to me? Because I've done it for many years and I've had great success with it. So I'm going to try and make this video as brief as possible because it's very simple. There's three things you need to consider. Number one, actually achieving the RPM. Number two, actually making power up there. And then number three, making it survive up there. So actually achieving the RPM with Trionic 5, it's been a myth that you can only rev it to 7,800 RPM because that's what the highest number on the laptop will show you. It'll just stop registering after that. The ECU actually goes far beyond that. I know this because I built my CAN bus dash and it talks to the ECU, and the ECU actually registers way up past 9,000. So that is just the laptop programming telling you that. So the first problem you're going to encounter with trying to turn the rev limiter way up or past 8,000 or whatever is that you're probably going to hit ignition or crank sensor sync issues around 6,000 to 7,000 RPM. To fix that, you need either a spacer on the crank sensor or a resistor in line with the crank sensor connector. So in my case, I have a 1.6 millimeter spacer on the crank sensor, and then that got me up to 8,100 RPM. And to get me from 8,100 to 87, I needed to add a 1,000 ohm resistor on the yellow wire of the crank sensor connector going to the ECU. So by doing that, you're actually dropping the voltage because this is a variable reluctance sensor on the crank sensor. It's not a Hall effect. So what happens is each tooth that it picks up, when the RPM rises, the voltage also rises. So then the voltage becomes too high on the waves for the ECU to actually pick up, because now it's saturating that chip and all it's seeing is basically mud. So to put in perspective, you get like a couple volts around idle from that sensor, and it's just like a sawtooth wave almost. And then at high RPM, you can get up to like 70 volts out of the crank sensor signal. So that's too high for the ECU to read. So you need a resistor and space a sensor to get a nice clean reading. So that's something you're going to have to play with because you're probably going to be the second person in the world to be doing that other than me. But you need to get the crank sensor to actually read properly up in those high RPM ranges. So once you have your crank sensor reading, you can literally turn the rev limiter to 9,000 and then the engine will do it. And then it'll explode because you don't have valve springs. So the valve springs I run is Maptune valve springs. They're just basically Volvo springs from what I know. But anything with that spring pressure or greater will work at that high RPM. So you have valve springs, you have the crank sensor reading correctly. Now it'll do 8,000, 9,000 RPM even, but now it'll only do it a few times because the bottom end is going to fall apart. On the stock rods, you will literally pull the studs out of the rod. You will literally stretch them until the nut has no tension, then the nut will back off and then the whole thing explodes. I've done this before. To repeatedly rev high, you need H-beam rods or some kind of rod that you can get an ARP 2000s bolt in. If you don't have that in there, your bottom end's not going to last long. So the next hurdle after that is the oiling system. I of course have a dry sump. You can get away with a wet sump, but you need a good pan. You need to be a good fabricator, make your own pan, make some good baffles, or have an AccuSump or something, and have your setup dialed so you're not getting oil pressure drops high up in the RPM range. So we've discussed the basics here of actually achieving that RPM. For a street car, all that advice will get you very far. Like, this thing lives above 8,000 all the time, downshifting and then just abusing it and whatever, right? 40 pounds of boost. But on a street car, that'll work. But now the last thing, the most important thing actually, which is the second point I was trying to make, is you need the thing to make power up there. There's no point in revving it past 7,000 if the torque is just falling off a cliff. So you need to dial in your cam timing. I have 26H H-Blom cams. So I've spent the time to adjust and get the actual degrees right on the cam to match the power band. Intake runner length, exhaust runner length, turbo setup, everything. Cylinder head porting, everything. I've optimized all of that for high RPM. Even the mapping in the ECU, the right amount of timing. Like these engines at high revs, you need a decent amount of timing. And the fueling needs to be very good. You need the flame speed to actually be able to drive the piston down. So that is how you do it. So this isn't really for the lighthearted. I mean, my daily driver, which is a T7 car, doesn't have crank sensor issues and whatnot. But that's a completely stock head with B204 pistons I put in there. And I rev it to 73. And it doesn't care. So that's high enough for most people. And you can just turn the limiter up and it'll work. Put valve springs in it if you feel comfortable, but I didn't bother. So 9,000 is kind of for the people who are just ready for problems, because even if your oil viscosity is a little bit wrong, like if it's too thick, it won't flow through the crank properly, you'll cavitate, ruin the bearings, whatnot. So unless you absolutely have to, I'd just keep it in the 7,000 range. So that's my 2 cents. I hope that helped. This is supposed to be a quick video. Let me know if I should make a more in-depth one. But yeah, that's all I have to say about that.